And I'm going to talk about this fifth idea, which is understanding life in terms of information and systems. And this is more speculative, but I think it will be increasingly important. And I think it's using information and systems to give explanations in biology. Now, thinking about biology as a complex system is actually very old. I've traced it back to as far back as I could go, with about 20 pages in Immanuel Kant, would you believe, the philosopher, who talked about complex biological systems and how that was important for life. And he was focused on the complexity and the way in which this is organized in a system that you find in life. What was added to that, particularly in the second half of the last century, was the notion of information, and that these complex systems could be understood in part by the flow of information through those particular systems. And these systems operate at different levels. I'm going to focus on the chemistry in cells, but neuron systems in brains would be another example. Ecological processes in ecosystems would be a third. And really the kernel of the idea is that you can understand and explain higher order biological phenomena. Phenomena like homeostasis, communication, reproduction, spatial and temporal organization of living things in terms of information and information flow through complex systems. So that's the starting point for this approach. And what it does is it emphasizes concepts like regulation, networks, organization, emergent behaviors, and I summarize it all in the following sentence. The objective in taking this approach is to translate the descriptions of the chemical and physical processes carried out in cells into the underlying system and the management of information within that system, i.e. gathering information, storing information, processing information, and using all of that to determine the outputs. And that's really the principle that we're talking about. Now, I think this is best to talk about with just a simple example. And the simple example is, once again, DNA. Now, when we look at DNA, this double helix, mostly we just wax lyrical about the beautiful structure, okay? That isn't really where the beauty of DNA lies. The beauty of DNA is that it is a consequence of this structure that you can understand heredity, because understanding that structure tells you that what DNA really is a digital information storage device. And that digital information is stored in the order of the 4 different nucleotides that make up DNA and the sequence in which they are actually found. So the sequence of the nucleotides encodes information. It's digitally encoded, and as a consequence of the central dogma, which I referred to earlier, it will determine protein structure, which in turn will determine the characteristics of proteins, which determine the phenotype, the way that cells behave. But, and this is the important point, it's only when the chemical structure is expressed in terms of information and information storage that it makes biological sense. You can describe the structure in terms of angstroms and where things are placed. It makes no sense at all till it's translated into information. And that's what Watson and Crick did in their theoretical side of that paper. So we understand DNA and what it's done by thinking about information, in this case, how information is stored. And it's fundamental and critical to understanding biology. The second one is illustrated by this here. Now, I don't know if you're like me. I sort of understand most machines built before 1900. And then after 1900, it gets more and more vague, okay? So this is a picture of a steam engine I found in a boat built in 1892 in New Zealand. And what this is a governor, okay? And you can immediately understand it. This is an example of negative feedback. This is a spindle connected to the steam engine. It rotates. When it rotates, these balls are flown out. You can all understand that, yeah? And as a consequence, it lifts its collar, which turns off the valve that controls how much steam goes into the engine. Therefore, the steam is no longer going into the engine. Therefore, the engine slows down until the balls go back in again and the reverse happens. This is a homeostatic mechanism, a negative feedback control. But you only understand what it does when it's described in terms of a negative feedback control. Now, Jacob and Monod, great French molecular biologists of the 50s and 60s, proposed from their studies in bacteria of lactose metabolism that there was a negative feedback loop operating. And these are three metabolites, three chemicals, being catalyzed going A to B to C. This is the principle by different enzymes. And the concept is that as C builds up, it inhibits A to B, and therefore you shut it down. So therefore, if C is rising, then it'll be switched off, it'll go down again, and you'll have an oscillation around a mean. It's a negative feedback control. If, on the other hand, C acts in a positive feedback way, it becomes a switch. Because as soon as you start going from A to B to C, and then C accelerates A to B, you're on a one-way ticket. You can only keep going, and you become a switch. So you have an example of positive and negative feedback, which is critical to how metabolism is all regulated. Now, I went to a conference which had one wit, I stole this slide from them. This is a radio, and all these components these are all oncogenes, the names of oncogenes that we have here. And the notion was, the speaker said, it's all like a circuit, all these genes are connected, and you get out of the radio sound, you get out of the cell, either a normally growing cell, or in this particular case, when there's all these alteration, you might get cancer. So that's the sort of the metaphor, the analogy there. And these various circuits, and I've just shown you a couple of simple ones, can be combined together to give you a whole rich variety of feedback controls, switches, timers, oscillators, toggles, all together that work in complex networks. Now, this is, however, a hardware circuit. And it's very important to realize in biology, it's what's been called rather wonderfully by Dennis Bray, a wetware circuit, because you connect all the different parts of the biological system through water, through solutions and diffusible chemicals, which means that when you want to modify behavior, you not only modify the information that goes in through DNA and so on, but you can reprogram what is connected to what. So it's a much richer environment to imagine how things may actually be connected. So what this is arguing is that we should consider the cell as a complex chemical system, this wetware, and it acts really like a logical computational machine of linked logical modules. And that's the point that I'm trying to make here. Now I'm going to finish with just a few examples of where this sort of thinking might lead. And the first thing is that there are many analogies you can make to other complex systems, from the social sciences downwards. Here is a network of aeroplane routes in the United States, and this is a collection showing you have hubs which connect important places and which allow subsidiary places to actually be connected via the main hub. So the hub is the center. So what you conclude looking at this is, forget what this is, but let's say it's Dulles, is that if you take out Dulles, you're in big trouble. Difficult to imagine, but actually true. However, if you take out, somewhere in the middle, say Kansas City, nobody cares, okay? It simply isn't important. And the reason I put it up there is that the network theorists who work on such complex patterns here have a great deal to contribute to understanding networks in biology as well. Second thing to recognize is that biological systems are complicated. And the problem we've got here is that the human brain likes to think in a simple way. So I've put two pathways up here. This is a collection of information going from the left to the right. It's a linear pathway. Our thinking naturally falls in that direction for most of us, or at least as I shall show you, for half of us. And you do something here, and something very closely related is here. However, biology, produced by evolution by natural selection, it's not designed, it's all sort of added on, you get great complexity. So whereas here you know if you block this, you will block this. If I say we'll block this, do you know what the outcome is here? You don't. It's all part of a complex system. And this is life, and this is only a aspect of life which is used rarely. The problem is many of us think like this, and I found the next picture in, I'm a pilot actually, a recreational pilot, and I found this in a manual I read, okay? And this says that men think in sort of ons and off switches, okay? And women are much better at thinking of the complexity of things and putting them together. Really true in my lab. That's why I have 50-50 men, women all the time in my lab. Both of them have their virtues, but just thinking like this is bad news. You really do have to have that across the board. When I show that in the United States, people grumble I'm being sexist and so on, but I think we're much more sophisticated in Imperial College. Okay. Now, although I'm talking about a single pathway here, like this, that if you introduce dynamics into information transfer, the whole communication scenario becomes much richer because you can pulse information down such a pathway. And so instead of it just being an on-off switch, if now, for example, you are pulsing 2 pieces of information down every minute versus 4, that can be interpreted differently. Now, that's obvious and doesn't seem very important, but using a metaphor, I'll show you how important it is. If you just have this system here, on-off, then what you can do is you have a traffic light, red or green. If you now introduce dynamics, as the Morse code is, you can write the works of Shakespeare. It's an enormous difference in information transfer if you take note of dynamics. And there is no doubt in my mind that dynamics is going to be important in these pathways that we look at in biology, and we haven't scratched the surface of it yet. There is enormous complexity there, enormous information transfer, which when we do synthetic biology, where we try and build from bottom up on simple engineering principles, which is how it's normally done, we will miss this. If we go the reverse way and take complex systems and strip it down, that complexity will emerge. It's just a particular lesson I think we have to learn. Now, we have to understand how spatial and temporal organization is formed. This is a phage, it's a virus, and we understand how form is produced here, because it's just molecules like Meccano sort of linking together, or Lego, better metaphor. But actually, living organisms are organized over a whole wide range of spaces. So, I mean, we recognize here in this room, little people like me, big people, fat people, thin people, and we are all formed in the same way. And we have to think about that differently, and I put up here Turing's great paper from the 1940s, nothing to do with computing here, but it was a paper he wrote on control circuits over space, which modeled a chemical reaction, the Zhabotinsky reaction, which essentially produces spatial structure by diffusion way beyond direct molecular interaction. And there is a principle there that's excited development biology for decades, and it's really not quite got there yet, even now, but which is very important. So that's another factor. And then my last one, before I end with a slightly technicolor ending, not literally, but just in what I'm about to say, is Harrison's clocks here. Because we have to remember, when thinking about information and complexity, we have to remember that biological machines are not designed. They evolve by natural selection. And that means that you start with something and you add things on, and you make things more complicated than they need be to actually deliver the outcome. We often think that biological systems, when you work on them, are perfect. They've been designed by evolution, by natural selection, to work perfectly. But we actually have to recognize that it makes do, and it works because it's as good as any other living thing that's around. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. And I use Harrison's clocks here. You'll remember Harrison, the clockmaker, who solved the longitude problem, to illustrate what I mean. there was the Longitude Prize given by the Admiralty in the 18th century, and you had to have an accurate clock. Harrison made this one. That was Harrison 1. It worked pretty well, but not that well. And he learnt from that and completely redesigned it and produced Harrison 2. And then learnt from that and made Harrison 3. And then finally, what won the prize was Harrison 4. Now, each one of these steps was intelligently designed. So what you see here doesn't look anything like what was up here, in fact. But evolution by natural selection, by the time you got to Harrison's 4 clocks, you'd have many components that were up there that were still there. Our appendix is the obvious example at what we use. So we shouldn't try and be too clever. We shouldn't try and think that you have biological explanations by the simplest explanation, which is the way a physicist would think about it. We have to recognize the complexity and the redundancy that's around that. Now, I want to finish, I said, with a slightly technicolor few sentences, because what we're talking about here is complexity in information management. And I think there is a possibility that this complexity will lead to counterintuitive explanations. You can't make obvious sense about it. It's not intuitive to quite work out what's happening. Now, most biologists, including myself, live in what I call a common sense world. You know, we have almost a sort of Newtonian type of way of thinking. I imagine this room as a cell, and there's a molecule over here, and it bounces to a molecule there. It's all Newtonian. But what I'm beginning to wonder is whether complexity will take us into a much stranger world, where that metaphor, that analogy in the way we think, will no longer be entirely appropriate. And in this sense, it may be like the changes that occur in physics, where in physics, the very big and the very small become increasingly bizarre to a common sense mind. And I'm wondering whether in biology that may happen as well. Think about physics again before 1900. It's mostly common sense. 1905, you have Einstein. Relativity starts getting tricky. If you read a popular book on relativity, you read it, it makes some sense, you close it, and then slowly it drifts away. You know? Because it isn't quite in our common sense world. You know, it's difficult imagining going at the speed of light and aging at a different speed from somebody else sitting on Earth. And it makes sense as you read it, but it isn't embedded in the way that we think. Now, if you have a problem with Einstein, move on to the 1920s and quantum mechanics, and you start living in an Alice in Wonderland world where nothing makes any sense whatsoever, where cats are alive and dead at the same time, and you can only make sense of it with mathematics and reasoning that is simply beyond the normal common sense. I can say this with great confidence because my daughter is a high-energy physicist. It's what she does. She works at CERN. And when I realized she doesn't understand it either, that I felt heartened by this. They have these little sort of workshops all the time to sort of remind themselves of the complexity and how you deal with it. And it's really, really difficult, because it is difficult. I hope I'm not insulting anybody here, but it makes sense in terms of the equations, and it gives exquisite descriptions of how things work, but it isn't in a common sense world. The question is, will the complexity of biology take us into a similar place? And I think that might well be the case. The way in which this is organized in a system that you find in life. What was added to that, particularly in the second half of the last century, was the notion of information, and that these complex systems could be understood in part by the flow of information through those particular systems. And these systems operate at different levels. I'm going to focus on the chemistry in cells, but neuron systems in brains would be another example. Ecological processes in ecosystems would be a third. And the kernel of the idea is that you can understand and explain higher order biological phenomena. Phenomena like, i.e., gathering information, storing information, processing information, and using all of that to determine the outputs. And that's really the principle that we're talking about. Now, I think this is best to talk about with just a simple example. And the simple example is, once again, DNA. Now, when we look at DNA, this double helix, mostly we just wax lyrical about the beautiful structure, okay? That isn't really where the beauty of DNA lies. The beauty of DNA is that it is a consequence of this structure that you can understand heredity, because understanding that structure tells you that what DNA really is a digital information storage device. Homeostasis, communication, reproduction, spatial and temporal organization of living things in terms of information and information flow through complex systems. So that's the starting point for this approach. And what it does is it emphasizes concepts like regulation, networks, organization, emergent behaviors. I summarize it all in the following sentence. The objective in taking this approach is to translate the descriptions of the chemical and physical processes carried out in cells into the underlying system and the management of information within that system. And that digital information is stored in the order of the 4 different nucleotides that make up DNA and the sequence in which they are actually found. So the sequence of the nucleotides encodes information. It's digitally encoded, and as a consequence of the central dogma, which I referred to earlier, it will determine protein structure, which in turn will determine the characteristics of proteins, which determine the phenotype, the way that cells behave. But, and this is the important point, it's only when the chemical structure is expressed in terms of information and information storage that it makes biological sense. You can describe the structure in terms of angstroms and where. And I'm going to talk about this 5th idea, which is understanding life in terms of information and systems. And this is more speculative, but I think it will be increasingly important. And I think it's using information and systems to give explanations in biology. Now, thinking about biology as a complex system is actually very old. I've traced it back to as far back as I could go, with about 20 pages in Immanuel Kant, would you believe, the philosopher, who talked about complex biological systems and how that was important for life. And he was focused on the complexity and the